Maximilian Ravencrest slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, sending papers scattering across his office floor. The quarterly reports showed another record-breaking profit, yet he felt absolutely nothing. For 3 years, every victory had tasted like ash in his mouth. "Sir, the board meeting has been moved to tomorrow morning," his assistant called through the intercom. He didn't respond. The 40-story view of Seattle's skyline stretched before him, but the city lights blurred together into meaningless dots. His phone buzzed with 17 missed calls from investors, each one desperate for his attention, his money, his approval. None of it mattered. The drive to his Bellevue estate took 40 minutes through evening traffic. Maximilian navigated the winding roads automatically, his mind trapped in the same loop that had consumed him since the accident. His parents, the betrayal, the emptiness that had replaced his heart. The iron gates of Ravencrest Manor opened at his approach. The sprawling property had belonged to his family for 4 generations, but now it felt like a mausoleum. He parked in the circular driveway and walked toward the main house, his footsteps echoing against the stone pathway. That's when he heard it. A voice, pure and haunting, drifted through the night air. Maximilian stopped dead in his tracks. The sound seemed to pierce through the wall he had built around his emotions, sending an unfamiliar shock through his chest. He followed the melody across the manicured grounds, past the fountain his mother had loved, toward the old chapel at the edge of the property. The Gothic structure had been abandoned for decades, too painful for the family to maintain after his grandmother's funeral. The voice grew stronger as he approached. It was a woman, singing something he didn't recognize, but the raw emotion in her tone made his hands tremble. When had he last felt anything so intensely? Maximilian pushed open the heavy wooden door, expecting it to creak and announce his presence. Instead, it moved silently on well-oiled hinges. Someone had been maintaining this place. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. At the altar, a young woman sat with her back to him, her voice filling the sacred space with a melody that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart back to life. Her hair fell in waves down her back, and she wore a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the dim light. She sang without accompaniment, her hands folded in her lap, completely unaware of his presence. Maximilian had built his fortune on reading people, on anticipating their moves, on staying 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. But this woman, this voice, this moment, it shattered every defense he had constructed. The song ended, leaving only silence between them. She began to turn, and Maximilian stepped backward into the shadows, unwilling to break whatever spell had just been cast. Through the crack in the door, he watched her profile as she gathered a small bag and walked toward a side exit he hadn't noticed. When her footsteps faded, he stepped back into the chapel. The space felt different now, charged with something he couldn't name. For the first time in 3 years, Maximilian Ravencrest felt truly awake. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security. "Carson, I need you to run surveillance on the chapel. Someone's been using it, and I want to know who." "Sir, that's probably just Evangeline from the groundskeeper's family. The Rosehavens have been taking care of the property for generations. She sings there sometimes." Evangeline. The name settled in his mind like a key finding its lock. "I want everything you can find on her. Background, family history, everything." "Sir, she's just everything, Carson." Maximilian ended the call and walked back to the altar where she had been sitting. A faint scent lingered in the air, something like jasmine and rain. He placed his hand on the stone where she had sat, and for a moment, he could almost feel warmth radiating from the cold surface. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory, something she had whispered during her final days about forgiveness and redemption. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of a dying mind, but now they seemed to carry weight he hadn't understood. The walk back to the main house felt shorter, his steps lighter. Inside his study, Maximilian poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey but didn't drink. Instead, he stood at the window facing the chapel, waiting for something he couldn't name. Tomorrow, he would learn everything about Evangeline Rosehaven. Tonight, for the first time since the accident, he would sleep without the nightmares that had haunted him. The voice in the chapel had awakened something he thought was dead forever, and Maximilian Ravencrest was determined to understand why. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, but he remained at the window, watching the shadows dance around the chapel where his life had just changed forever. Evangeline Rosehaven woke to the sound of her adoptive father hammering fence posts behind the main house. She checked her phone, 6 in the morning, which meant Henry was already 3 hours into his workday. The Ravencrest estate demanded perfection, and Henry delivered it without question, just as his father and grandfather had before him. She dressed quickly in jeans and a cotton sweater, then headed to the kitchen where Martha was already preparing breakfast for the three of them. The woman who had raised her from infancy looked up with concern creasing her weathered face. "You were singing late again last night." In the chapel, Evangeline poured herself coffee from the pot Martha always kept brewing. "I couldn't sleep. The music helps. That place makes me nervous, sweetheart." Mrs. Ravencrest used to say it held too many memories. The older woman's worry was genuine, but Evangeline had been drawn to the chapel since childhood. Something about the acoustics, the way her voice seemed to fill every corner of the sacred space, made her feel connected to something larger than herself. Martha and Henry had given her everything they could, but questions about her origins gnawed at her constantly. "Did my birth mother ever sing?" Martha's hand stilled on the mixing bowl. This conversation happened every few months, always ending the same way. "I told you, honey. She was young, scared, and couldn't care for you. That's all we know." Evangeline had stopped believing that explanation years ago. The Rosehavens weren't the type to lie, but they definitely weren't telling her everything. Sometimes she caught them exchanging glances when she asked about her past, as if they were guarding secrets too dangerous to share. The new owner was in the chapel last night. Martha dropped her spoon. "What?" "I saw a shadow by the door when I was leaving. Someone was watching me." "Evangeline, listen to me carefully. You cannot go there anymore. Mr. Ravencrest is not like his parents. Martha struggled for the right words. "He's a very different kind of man." 20 miles away, Maximilian sat in his downtown office reviewing the file Carson had delivered an hour earlier. Evangeline Rosehaven, 23 years old, no birth certificate on file in Washington state. Adopted informally by Henry and Martha Rosehaven when she was 6 months old. No record of biological parents. The gaps in her history were too convenient, too clean. Someone had scrubbed her past deliberately. "Sir." Carson stood in the doorway. "There's something else." "About the Thornfield case." Maximilian's jaw tightened. He had been hunting Damien Thornfield for 3 years, following cold leads across 2 continents. The man who had caused his parents' death and stolen their fortune had vanished like smoke. "What did you find?" Local records show a Thornfield family lived in the area around the time of Miss Rosehaven's birth. They disappeared suddenly about 23 years ago. The coffee in Maximilian's cup turned cold as pieces of a puzzle began shifting in his mind. His parents had died in a head-on collision on a rainy night. Their car forced off Highway 520 by a drunk driver who fled the scene. Damien Thornfield had been his father's business partner, the man who had access to every account, every investment, every decision that built the Ravencrest empire. Within hours of the funeral, their assets had been liquidated, transferred through a complex web of shell companies, and vanished. Damien had played the grieving friend perfectly, consoling Maximilian while systematically destroying everything his family had built. "Run DNA analysis. I want to know if there's any connection between Evangeline and the Thornfield family." "Sir, that would require." "I don't care what it requires. Make it happen." After Carson left, Maximilian stood at his office window, watching the morning traffic crawl through the city below. His grandmother had always believed in fate, in connections that transcended logic. She would have said that hearing Evangeline's voice in the chapel was no coincidence. If she was connected to Thornfield, if the man who destroyed his family had somehow planted someone inside his own property, the irony would be almost poetic. But the voice that had awakened something in his chest didn't feel like deception. It felt like salvation. His phone buzzed with a text from his uncle Sterling. "Board meeting moved to this afternoon. The Chicago acquisition needs your approval." Sterling had been pushing aggressive expansion since taking over as COO, deals that felt rushed and poorly researched. Maximilian had built his comeback on patience and precision, but his uncle seemed determined to accelerate their timeline. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Maximilian closed the file on his desk and made a decision that would change everything. Tonight, he would return to the chapel. If Evangeline came to sing again, he would finally step out of the shadows and discover the truth about the woman whose voice had brought him back to life. The truth about whether she was his salvation or his destruction. Maximilian arrived at the chapel an hour before sunset, positioning himself behind the stone pillar where shadows would conceal his presence. The wooden pews creaked under his weight as he settled in to wait. Carson's report lay folded in his jacket pocket. DNA results would take 48 hours, but preliminary background checks had revealed more questions than answers. The Thornfield family had owned property adjacent to the Ravencrest estate 24 years ago. They had vanished within weeks of Evangeline's birth, leaving behind unpaid taxes and a foreclosure notice. Too many coincidences for Maximilian's taste. Footsteps echoed on the stone pathway outside. Maximilian's pulse quickened as the chapel door opened with its silent efficiency. Evangeline entered, carrying a small leather bag and wearing a navy dress that made her look younger than her 23 years. She walked to the altar with practiced familiarity, settling onto the stone step exactly where she had sat the night before. When she began to sing, Maximilian felt the same jolt of electricity course through his chest. Her voice was even more powerful up close, filling the vaulted space with a haunting melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded. This time, he didn't hide. Maximilian stepped out from behind the pillar, his footsteps deliberate on the stone floor. Evangeline's song cut off mid-note, and she spun around, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like fear. "Please don't stop," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I've been listening for 2 nights. Your voice is extraordinary." She clutched her bag against her chest, studying his face in the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. "You're Maximilian Ravencrest. And you're Evangeline. You've been taking care of this place. Henry and Martha told you." She relaxed slightly, but remained poised to run. "I'm sorry if I was trespassing." The chapel was falling apart, and it seemed wrong to let it decay. Maximilian moved closer, noting how she tracked his movements like a deer ready to bolt. "This building has been in my family for generations. My grandmother used to say it held the memory of every prayer spoken within these walls." "Your grandmother sounds wise." She was. She also believed that some connections transcend logic. He stopped 5 feet away, close enough to see the intelligence in her green eyes, far enough to keep from frightening her. "What made you choose this place?" Evangeline looked around the chapel as if seeing it for the first time. "The acoustics are perfect. When I sing here, it feels like my voice can reach places it was meant to go." "Places like what?" "Like the past. Like people who can't hear me anymore." The pain in her voice resonated with something deep in Maximilian's chest. He recognized the sound of someone carrying grief too heavy for their years. "Who are you trying to reach?" Before Evangeline could answer, the chapel door burst open. Sterling Ravencrest strode in, his expensive suit incongruous against the ancient stone walls. "Max, there you are. We've been looking everywhere." Sterling's gaze shifted to Evangeline, and his expression hardened. "I see you've met our little songbird." Maximilian felt Evangeline tense beside him. "Sterling, this is Evangeline Rosehaven. Her family maintains the grounds. I know exactly who she is." Sterling's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Evangeline, isn't it time you headed home? The groundskeeper's cottage is quite a walk in the dark." The dismissal was clear and calculated. Evangeline gathered her bag and stood, but Maximilian stepped closer to her. "Actually, I was hoping Evangeline might join me for dinner. We were having an interesting conversation." Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid that's impossible. The board meeting ran late, and we have urgent matters to discuss. The Chicago acquisition needs your immediate attention. The Chicago deal can wait." "Actually, it can't. Our competition has accelerated their timeline. We need to move tonight, or we lose everything." Maximilian studied his uncle's face, reading the subtle tells that indicated stress. Sterling was lying. But about what? The urgency of the deal, or something else entirely? "I'll call you in an hour," Maximilian told him. Sterling's eyes flicked between Maximilian and Evangeline. "Of course. Evangeline, perhaps you should know that your presence here might be causing complications for your adoptive parents' employment. The estate has very specific protocols about fraternization between staff families and ownership." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Evangeline's face went pale, and she took a step toward the door. "That won't be necessary," Maximilian said, his voice carrying the steel that had built his fortune. Sterling, we'll discuss this later. His uncle nodded curtly and left, but not before shooting Evangeline a look that promised future consequences. I should go, Evangeline said quietly. Don't let him intimidate you. Sterling doesn't speak for me. He speaks for your family's business interests. Henry and Martha have worked here their entire lives. I won't jeopardize that for them. Maximilian watched her walk toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to stop her. Evangeline. She turned back, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Tomorrow night. Same time. I'll make sure Sterling isn't here. I don't think that's wise. Wisdom is overrated. Some of the best decisions I've made have been completely reckless. A small smile touched her lips. Is that how you built your empire? Reckless decisions. That's how I lost it the first time. And how I got it back. After she left, Maximilian remained in the chapel, processing what had just happened. Sterling's interference felt orchestrated, as if his uncle had been watching and waiting for the right moment to insert himself into the situation. He pulled out his phone and called Carson. I want complete surveillance on Sterling's activities. Phone records, meetings, financial transactions. Everything. Sir, he's your uncle. Your business partner. Which is exactly why I need to know what he's hiding. Maximilian looked at the altar where Evangeline had been sitting, remembering the way her voice had filled the space with something that felt like hope. Whatever game Sterling was playing, whatever secrets the Rosehaven family was hiding, he would uncover the truth. Even if it destroyed everything he thought he knew about his own family. Carson's call came at dawn, 2 hours earlier than expected. Maximilian answered on the first ring, already knowing that early calls never brought good news. The DNA results are back. Sir, you need to see this in person. 20 minutes later, Maximilian sat in his downtown office staring at a genetic analysis report that confirmed his worst fears. Evangeline Rosehaven shared 50% of her DNA with samples taken from Damien Thornfield's abandoned property. Father and daughter. The woman whose voice had awakened his heart was the child of the man who had destroyed his family. There's more, Carson said, sliding another folder across the desk. Financial records from the Thornfield property sale. It was purchased by a shell company registered to Sterling Ravencrest 3 months before your parents' accident. Maximilian's blood turned to ice. Sterling knew. It appears so. The timing suggests he may have facilitated the Thornfield family's placement on your property. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sterling hadn't just known about Evangeline's parentage. He had orchestrated her presence at Ravencrest Manor. But why? What possible advantage could his uncle gain from placing Damien Thornfield's daughter under his nose? His phone buzzed with a text from the family estate. Your grandmother is asking for you. Please come immediately. Dr. Morrison. Grandmother Adelaide had been fading for weeks, slipping in and out of consciousness as her 93-year-old body finally surrendered to time. Maximilian hadn't expected her to last this long, but Adelaide Ravencrest had always been too stubborn to die on anyone's schedule but her own. The drive to the estate felt like a funeral procession. Every tree, every curve in the road reminded him of childhood visits when his grandmother would tell him stories about destiny and purpose. She had always insisted that the Ravencrest family was bound to something larger than wealth or business success. Dr. Morrison met him at the front door of the main house, his expression grave. She's been asking for you since midnight. I don't think she has much time left. Adelaide lay propped against pillows in the master bedroom, her once commanding presence reduced to bird-like fragility. But her eyes remained sharp, fixing on Maximilian with the intensity that had made her a formidable matriarch. You found her, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Found who, grandmother? The girl with the voice. Damien's daughter. Maximilian's heart stopped. You knew? Adelaide's laugh was more cough than sound. I've known since the day Martha brought her home. Did you think I wouldn't recognize those eyes? She has her father's eyes. Then you know what he did to us. What he stole. I know what you believe he did. Adelaide gripped his hand with surprising strength. But some truths are more complex than they appear. He killed my parents. He destroyed our family. Sterling killed your parents. The words hit Maximilian like a physical blow. What? Your uncle has been planning this for decades. Damien discovered the embezzlement, the shell companies, the systematic theft of our assets. He tried to warn your father, but Sterling moved first. Adelaide's breathing became labored, but she continued with determination. The accident wasn't random. Sterling paid someone to force your parents off the road, then used Damien as a scapegoat. Poor boy fled with his pregnant wife to protect them both. Maximilian felt the world tilting beneath him. Why didn't you tell me? Because you weren't ready to hear it. Your rage was the only thing keeping you alive after the funeral. I couldn't take that away until you found something worth living for. And Evangeline? Adelaide's eyes brightened with something that looked like hope. My great-grandfather built the chapel for his wife, who had the most beautiful voice in 3 counties. Legend says she sang their love into existence, called him home from a war everyone thought would kill him. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. I dreamed about her for weeks before she arrived at our door. A child with golden hair and her father's eyes, carrying a voice that could heal what Sterling broke. The prophecy writes itself, Maxwell. The daughter of your greatest enemy will be your salvation, but only if you choose love over vengeance. Adelaide's grip loosened, and her breathing became shallow. Don't let Sterling destroy this gift. Don't let him take her from you like he took everything else. Grandmother, but Adelaide Ravencrest had spoken her final words. 3 hours later, Maximilian stood in the chapel where everything had begun, waiting for Evangeline with his heart full of poison and his mind spinning with revelations. The DNA report burned in his jacket pocket like evidence of betrayal, even though he now understood she was as much a victim as he was. When she arrived, carrying her leather bag and humming softly to herself, Maximilian felt the familiar jolt of recognition. But now it was tainted with the knowledge of who she was, what her presence meant. You came, she said, settling onto the altar step. I had to. There are things we need to discuss. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. You sound different tonight. Maximilian pulled the DNA report from his pocket and placed it on the stone between them. Your father is Damien Thornfield. Evangeline stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. I don't understand. The man who destroyed my family. The man I've been hunting for 3 years. He's your biological father. That's impossible. Martha and Henry said my parents were young and scared. They never mentioned any names. Because they were protecting you. Because they knew that if I ever discovered the truth, I might. Might what? Evangeline stood, backing toward the door. Might hurt me. Might use me to get to him. I don't know what I might have done, but I know what I'm doing now. Maximilian moved between her and the exit, his expression hard with resolve. You're going to help me find him. You're going to help me get justice for what he did to my family. I don't know where he is. I've never even met him. Then you'll learn. You'll make contact. You'll do whatever it takes. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. And if I refuse? Then Henry and Martha lose their jobs, their home, their pension. They'll have nothing. The threat hung between them like a blade. Evangeline looked at the man who had awakened something beautiful in her heart, seeing clearly for the first time that he was capable of cruelty when it served his purposes. I was wrong about you, she whispered. No, you weren't. But sometimes wrong doesn't matter. Evangeline walked to the door, then turned back one final time. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what my father did to your family, but punishing me won't bring them back. After she left, Maximilian remained alone in the chapel, surrounded by stained glass angels who seemed to judge him with their painted eyes. His grandmother's prophecy echoed in his memory, but he pushed it aside. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Justice was all that mattered now, even if it destroyed the only thing that had made him feel alive in 3 years. Sterling Ravencrest stood in the boardroom of Ravencrest Industries, watching his nephew stare out the window at the Seattle skyline. 3 days had passed since Adelaide's funeral, and Maximilian hadn't spoken more than necessary to anyone. The Chicago acquisition papers need your signature, Sterling said, sliding the contract across the mahogany table. Our investors are getting nervous about the delay. Maximilian didn't move. Cancel it. What? Cancel the deal. Something doesn't feel right about the timing. Sterling's carefully constructed mask slipped for just a moment. Max, we've invested months in this opportunity. The profit margins alone are too good to be true. Maximilian turned from the window, his eyes sharp with suspicion. I've been reviewing the financial projections. The numbers have been manipulated. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. How long have you been cooking our books, Uncle? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sterling had prepared for this confrontation since the night he'd found Maximilian in the chapel with Evangeline, but facing it was different than planning for it. Your grief is making you paranoid. I've done nothing but protect this family's interests since your parents died. By embezzling company funds? By setting up shell corporations? By placing Damien Thornfield's daughter under my roof to distract me while you systematically looted our assets? Sterling's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The company was bleeding money. Your father's conservative strategies were destroying us. So you had him killed. I had him removed from an equation he was too stubborn to solve himself. The casual admission of murder hung between them like poison gas. Maximilian felt the same cold rage that had sustained him for 3 years, but now it had a different target. Where is Damien Thornfield? Dead. Car accident in Vancouver 2 years ago. Very tragic. Maximilian studied his uncle's face, reading the tells that indicated deception. You're lying. Does it matter? The man is gone. His daughter is here, under your control. Use her to rebuild what we lost. Then dispose of her when she's no longer useful. Like you disposed of my parents? Sterling straightened his tie, his businessman's mask sliding back into place. Your parents were obstacles to progress. Evangeline is an opportunity. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. Before Maximilian could respond, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Sir, there's a woman here demanding to see you. She says she's Evangeline Rosehaven's mother. Sterling and Maximilian exchanged glances. This wasn't part of anyone's plan. Send her in. The woman who entered the boardroom carried herself like royalty despite her worn clothing and travel-weary appearance. She had Evangeline's green eyes and the same stubborn set to her jaw, but where Evangeline radiated innocence, this woman seemed carved from bitter experience. I'm Victoria Thornfield, she announced, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested years spent far from Seattle. I've come for my daughter. Sterling recovered first. Mrs. Thornfield, what a surprise. We were under the impression you were dead. That was always the plan, wasn't it? Keep me away long enough for you to use Evangeline as leverage against my husband. Your husband is dead, Maximilian said flatly. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. Is that what Sterling told you? Damien is very much alive, hiding in a fishing village in Nova Scotia, terrified that your uncle's hired killers will find him. Impossible. I have photographs, phone records, video calls from last week. Victoria pulled a tablet from her bag and placed it on the conference table. He's been waiting for me to retrieve our daughter so we can disappear permanently. The screen showed a man Maximilian recognized from old business photos. Older, grayer, but unmistakably Damien Thornfield. He was sitting in what looked like a modest kitchen, speaking directly to the camera. Victoria, if you're watching this, it means you've found Evangeline. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't protect her. Tell her everything we did was to keep her safe from Sterling's reach. Maximilian felt the ground shifting beneath him again. He's been alive this entire time, hiding like a coward while I worked 3 jobs in Montreal to save enough money to come back for our child. Victoria's voice carried 23 years of accumulated rage. Do you have any idea what it's like to give up your baby to strangers, knowing you might never see her again? Why come back now? Sterling asked, his tone carefully neutral. Because I finally have evidence of what you really are. Victoria pulled a thick envelope from her bag. Bank records, assassination contracts, recorded conversations. Everything Damien gathered before he fled. Sterling's face went white. Those are fabrications. The FBI will determine that when I turn them over tomorrow morning. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to make a deal. What kind of deal? Full pardons for Damien and myself in exchange for our silence. $10 million as compensation for what you stole from us. And my daughter, free to choose her own future. Maximilian watched this negotiation with growing horror. His uncle was a murderer, his enemy was innocent, and the woman he was falling for was a bargaining chip in a game that had been rigged from the beginning. Where is Evangeline now? He asked. Packing, Victoria said. I told the Rosehavens the truth about who I am. They're heartbroken, but they understand. We leave tonight. No. Both women turned to stare at Maximilian. Sterling looked as if he were calculating the odds of surviving the next 10 minutes. She doesn't know you, Maximilian continued. You abandoned her as an infant. You have no right to tear her away from the only family she's ever known. I have every right. I'm her mother, and I'm the man who's going to marry her. The words surprised everyone in the room, including Maximilian himself. But as soon as he spoke them, he knew they were true. Whatever complicated history existed between their families, whatever crimes had been committed in the name of business or vengeance, none of it mattered compared to what he felt when Evangeline sang in the chapel. Victoria's expression softened slightly. She hasn't mentioned you. Because I've been an idiot. Because I let Sterling's lies poison what could have been beautiful. It's too late for sentiment, Sterling interrupted. Mrs. Thornfield has evidence that could destroy us all. We need to focus on damage control. Maximilian turned to face his uncle fully. The only damage that needs controlling is you. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I'd like to report a murder confession. Sterling Ravencrest, CEO of Ravencrest Industries, just admitted to arranging the deaths of my parents, Jonathan and Catherine Ravencrest, 3 years ago. Sterling lunged for the phone, but Maximilian stepped back smoothly. The call is already connected. They heard everything. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Evangeline sat on the narrow bed in her childhood room, watching Martha fold clothes into a suitcase with trembling hands. Through the window, she could see police cars surrounding the main house, their red and blue lights painting the evening sky in chaos. I should have told you years ago, Martha whispered, not meeting her eyes. About your mother. About why she really left you with us. 23 years, Martha. 23 years of lies. Not lies. Protection. Victoria was so young when you were born, barely 18 herself. She and your father were terrified that Sterling would use you against them. Evangeline picked up the small jewelry box that had belonged to her adoptive grandmother, the only inheritance she'd ever claimed. Inside lay a silver locket she'd worn since childhood, supposedly a gift from her birth parents. Now, even that felt contaminated by deception. Did you know? About what Sterling did to the Ravencrest family. Martha's hands stilled on the suitcase. We suspected. Henry saw things over the years, heard conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. But we were groundskeepers, Evangeline. Who would have believed us? A knock interrupted them. Victoria Thornfield stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in the modest cottage that had housed her daughter for over 2 decades. The police want to speak with you, Victoria said. As a witness to Sterling's activities on the property, Evangeline studied the woman who claimed to be her mother. Victoria had her eyes and her stubborn chin, but they were strangers to each other. 23 years couldn't be erased by shared DNA. And after I give my statement, we leave. Tonight. Your father is waiting in Canada, and we have new identities prepared. The 3 of us can finally be a family. I already have a family. Victoria glanced at Martha and Henry, who had appeared behind her in the doorway. They've done their job well. I'll give them that. But they're not your blood, Evangeline. They can't protect you from what's coming. What's coming? Before Victoria could answer, another figure appeared in the cottage doorway. Maximilian stood there looking haggard, his expensive suit wrinkled and his hair disheveled. Behind him, she could see federal agents securing the main house. I need to talk to you, he said, his eyes locked on Evangeline's face. I think you've said enough. Victoria stepped protectively in front of her daughter. Not to you. To her. Evangeline felt her heart clench at the sound of his voice. 3 days ago, he had been the man who awakened something beautiful in her soul. Now he was the enemy who had threatened her family and used her grief as a weapon. There's nothing left to say. There's everything to say. About Sterling, about the lies, about what I felt before I knew who you were. Before you knew I was the daughter of your enemy. Before I knew my enemy was innocent. The words hung in the small room like a confession. Evangeline wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the pain she heard in his voice, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. It doesn't matter now. Too much has been broken. Maximilian stepped into the room, ignoring Victoria's protests. Nothing has to be broken. Sterling's been arrested. The truth about my parents' death is finally coming out. We can start over. With what? Built on what foundation? Evangeline stood, wrapping her arms around herself. You threatened Henry and Martha. You were willing to destroy innocent people to get what you wanted. I was wrong. I was angry and grieving, and you showed me exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Maximilian had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding their motivations and desires. But he had completely misjudged the woman standing before him. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be better. She doesn't have time for your redemption arc, Victoria interrupted. Sterling's arrest doesn't guarantee our safety. There are other people involved in this conspiracy, other threats we don't know about yet. Then stay. Let me protect you. Evangeline laughed bitterly. Like you protected us from Sterling? Like you protected your own parents? The words were cruel and she knew it. But Evangeline felt raw and betrayed by everyone she had trusted. Martha and Henry had hidden her identity. Victoria had abandoned her as an infant. Maximilian had manipulated her emotions and threatened her family. That's not fair, Maximilian said quietly. Fair. Evangeline's voice rose. Fair would have been growing up knowing my real name. Fair would have been Sterling facing justice before he destroyed more lives. Fair would have been you trusting me enough to tell me the truth instead of playing games. I was trying to protect you. No, you were trying to use me. There's a difference. Federal agents appeared behind Maximilian, and one of them addressed Victoria. Ma'am, we're ready for your daughter's statement now. Victoria moved toward Evangeline. After this, we leave immediately. The car is already packed. I haven't agreed to go with you. You don't have a choice. Sterling's network extends further than just Seattle. Staying here puts everyone you care about in danger. Evangeline looked at Martha and Henry, seeing the fear in their weathered faces. They had given her everything, sacrificed their own safety to raise her as their own daughter. She couldn't repay that devotion by putting them in Sterling's crosshairs. Give me 10 minutes to finish packing. Evangeline, please. Maximilian stepped forward, but she held up her hand to stop him. You made your choice when you decided revenge was more important than truth. I'm making mine now. She walked past him toward the main house, not trusting herself to look back. Behind her, she heard Victoria explaining to the agents about witness protection, about new identities and safe houses. The federal interview took an hour. Evangeline answered every question about Sterling's behavior, about conversations she had overheard, about the suspicious meetings that had taken place on the estate. Through the conference room window, she could see Maximilian speaking with other agents, his hands gesturing as he provided his own testimony. When it was over, Victoria led her to a black sedan waiting in the circular driveway. Henry and Martha stood beside it, their faces streaked with tears. You'll always be our daughter, Martha whispered, pulling Evangeline into a fierce embrace. No matter what name you carry or where you go, take care of yourselves. Don't let anyone blame you for what Sterling did. Henry hugged her next, his work-roughened hands gentle on her shoulders. Your voice will find its way back home someday. Voices like yours always do. As the car pulled away from Ravencrest Manor, Evangeline saw Maximilian standing in the doorway of the main house. Even from a distance, she could see the defeat in his posture, the weight of everything he had lost. For a moment, she almost asked Victoria to stop the car, almost let herself believe that love could overcome the lies and betrayals that had poisoned their beginning. But trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. And Evangeline Rosehaven, or whatever her real name would be, was too wounded to try. 2 weeks after Evangeline disappeared with Victoria, Maximilian sat in the federal courthouse listening to Sterling's attorney argue for bail. The man who had murdered his parents looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, but his eyes still carried the calculating intelligence that had fooled everyone for decades. Your Honor, my client has deep ties to the community and poses no flight risk, the defense attorney claimed. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chun stood to object. Mr. Ravencrest orchestrated multiple murders, extensive financial fraud, and has demonstrated a pattern of eliminating witnesses. The state considers him extremely dangerous. Judge Morrison reviewed the case file, her expression grave. Bail denied. Trial date set for September 15th. As Sterling was led away in handcuffs, he caught Maximilian's eye and mouthed something that looked like, "This isn't over." The threat was clear enough. Outside the courthouse, Carson waited with another file folder that had become a familiar sight over the past 2 weeks. More evidence, Maximilian asked. Something different. We found Damien Thornfield. Maximilian's pulse quickened. Where? He's not in Nova Scotia. He's been in a federal safe house in Oregon for the past 3 years, cooperating with an FBI investigation into Sterling's activities. The revelation hit like a physical blow. What investigation? Apparently, your uncle has been running a sophisticated embezzlement operation across multiple companies. The Ravencrest fortune was just his latest target. Carson handed over the file. Damien approached the FBI 6 months before your parents' death. He'd discovered Sterling's shell companies and tried to warn your father. Maximilian opened the file to find photographs of Damien in what looked like a debriefing room, pointing to charts and financial documents. The timestamps showed meetings dating back for years. Sterling found out about the FBI contact. Carson continued. That's why he moved up his timeline. The car accident was meant to eliminate both your parents and Damien, but Damien had already gone into hiding. And Evangeline? Placed with the Rosehavens as part of witness protection. The FBI needed her close enough to monitor, but safe enough that Sterling wouldn't see her as a threat. Maximilian felt the last pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Sterling knew exactly who she was. From the beginning, he's been feeding you information designed to turn you against her family. The DNA results, the property records, even the timing of Victoria's arrival, it was all orchestrated to create maximum chaos. Why? Because he needed you distracted while he executed the final phase of his plan. The Chicago acquisition was going to be his exit strategy. Liquidate the remaining Ravencrest assets, transfer everything offshore, then disappear before anyone realized what happened. Maximilian's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Ravencrest? This is Agent Patricia Williams with the FBI. We need to meet immediately. Evangeline Thornfield is in danger. 30 minutes later, Maximilian sat in a downtown coffee shop facing a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Agent Williams spread photographs across the small table between them. Sterling's network is larger than we initially realized. He has contacts in organized crime, international finance, and private security. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're planning to eliminate the remaining witnesses. Evangeline and her parents. All 3 of them. Plus anyone else who can connect Sterling to the original murders. Williams looked directly at him. Including you. Where are they now? That's the problem. Victoria Thornfield never made contact with our safe house. They disappeared completely after leaving Seattle. Maximilian studied the photographs, recognizing some faces from business conferences and social events. People he had trusted, people who had been positioning themselves to profit from his family's destruction. How do we find them? We've been hoping you might have ideas. You knew Evangeline better than anyone else involved in this case. The truth of that statement cut deep. He had known her voice, her kindness, her strength. But he had never truly known her heart, because he had been too consumed with his own pain to listen. She sang in the chapel because it reminded her of something. Someone she was trying to reach. Her adoptive grandmother, maybe? Someone from her childhood. Maximilian closed his eyes, remembering their conversations in the chapel. She said the acoustics made her feel like her voice could reach places it was meant to go. Places like the past. Like people who couldn't hear her anymore. That doesn't narrow it down much. No, but it tells us something about how she thinks. Evangeline doesn't run from things. She confronts them, processes them, finds a way to make peace with them. Meaning she wouldn't just disappear into witness protection. She want to understand everything first. She want to know the complete truth about her father, about what really happened to my parents, about Sterling's network. Williams leaned forward. Are you suggesting she's investigating this herself? I'm suggesting she's exactly like her father. Too stubborn to hide when people she cares about are in danger. His phone rang again. This time, the number was one he recognized from years of business dealings. Max, thank God, came a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. This is Damien Thornfield. I know you have no reason to trust me, but my daughter is missing and I think Sterling's people have found us. Where are you? Portland. Victoria and Evangeline were supposed to meet me here yesterday, but they never showed up. Their car was found abandoned outside the city with signs of a struggle. Maximilian was already standing, motioning for Williams to follow him. We're coming to get you. Don't trust anyone else until we arrive. Max, there's something else you need to know. About the prophecy your grandmother mentioned. What about it? She called me the night before she died. Said the chapel had shown her something in a dream. Said Evangeline's voice wasn't just meant to heal your heart. It was meant to save all of us. Save us from what? From Sterling's final move. He's not just trying to eliminate witnesses. He's planning something that will destroy everyone connected to both our families. The line went dead. Maximilian looked at Agent Williams, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. Somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, Evangeline was in the hands of people who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. And the woman whose voice had awakened his heart might be the only person who could stop them. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Portland looked like a dozen others in the industrial district, but the black SUVs parked outside told Maximilian this was the right place. Through his earpiece, Agent Williams coordinated with the FBI tactical team surrounding the building. Thermal imaging shows 4 hostiles and 3 civilians in the main warehouse space, came the voice of the team leader. We're ready to breach on your signal. Maximilian crouched behind a shipping container, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. Somewhere inside that building, Evangeline was being held by people who had already proven they would kill without hesitation. The thought of losing her before he could tell her the truth about everything made his chest feel like it was caving in. Remember, Sterling's people are professionals, Williams whispered through the comm. They won't hesitate to use the hostages as shields. Through a grimy window, Maximilian caught a glimpse of movement inside. Evangeline sat tied to a chair in the center of the warehouse, her head held high despite the fear that must have been coursing through her veins. Victoria was beside her, unconscious and slumped forward. A third figure he recognized as Damien Thornfield stood against the far wall, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. She's alive, he reported. Copy that. We move in 60 seconds. Maximilian's phone buzzed with an incoming call from inside the warehouse. One of Sterling's men must have Evangeline's phone. Answer it, Williams ordered. Keep them talking. Maximilian Ravencrest, he answered. Mr. Ravencrest, how good of you to join us. The voice was smooth, professional, with a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins. I am Victor Kozlov. Perhaps you've heard the name. Maximilian had heard it whispered in business circles, a fixer who handled problems too sensitive for conventional solutions. If Sterling had hired Kozlov, the situation was even more dangerous than they'd realized. What do you want? Originally, just to eliminate the witnesses who could connect Mr. Sterling to certain unfortunate events. But circumstances have changed. It seems the FBI has been more thorough than anticipated. Meaning we need a new strategy. Mr. Sterling's assets have been frozen, his network exposed. But there's still one valuable commodity we can leverage. Through the window, Maximilian watched as one of Kozlov's men moved closer to Evangeline. She didn't flinch, but he could see her hands clenched into fists behind the chair. The Ravencrest fortune, Kozlov continued. Sterling tells me you've rebuilt quite impressively since your parents' death. $50 million should be sufficient to secure our permanent silence and the safe passage of my employer. And if I refuse, then Miss Thornfield learns exactly how her father really died. Because despite what the FBI told you, Damien Thornfield has been dead for 6 months. The man in our custody is actually FBI agent Michael Torres, who's been playing the role rather convincingly. Maximilian's blood turned to ice. You're lying. Ask him yourself. Through the comm, he heard Kozlov addressing someone inside the warehouse. Agent Torres, would you care to explain to Mr. Ravencrest how you've been deceiving his girlfriend about her father's identity? A weak voice came through the phone, barely recognizable, but clearly not Damien Thornfield. The real Damien was killed in protective custody. Car bomb in Oregon. I've been playing the role to keep the investigation alive. Evangeline's voice cut through the static, strong despite her circumstances. So my father really is dead. I'm sorry, Torres whispered. Touching, Kozlov interrupted. Now, Mr. Ravencrest, about that $50 million. You have 10 minutes to transfer the funds, or we start eliminating witnesses, beginning with the lovely Miss Thornfield. The line went dead. Change of plan, Williams said through the earpiece. We go in now. Wait. Maximilian pulled off his earpiece and started walking toward the warehouse entrance. Where are you going? To end this. He pushed through the front door with his hands raised, knowing the thermal imaging would have revealed his approach. 3 armed men immediately trained their weapons on him, but he kept walking until he stood 15 feet from Evangeline's chair. The money will take time to transfer, he announced. But I have a better offer. Kozlov emerged from the shadows, a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes. I'm listening. Me for them. Sterling's real target was always the Ravencrest family. You eliminate me, You complete the contract and can disappear with whatever assets Sterling has left. Maximilian, no, Evangeline said firmly. Don't you dare. He looked at her directly for the first time in 2 weeks, seeing the strength and defiance that had made him fall in love with her voice in the first place. I'm sorry for everything I put you through, for not trusting you, for letting my need for revenge poison what we could have had. This isn't how you apologize for being an idiot. Despite everything, Maximilian smiled. Even tied to a chair with armed killers surrounding her, Evangeline Thornfield was magnificent. Actually, it's exactly how I apologize. By choosing love over revenge. By proving that you matter more than anything else in the world. Kozlov raised his weapon. How romantic. Unfortunately, the contract has evolved. We need the money and the elimination of witnesses. Then you'll have to shoot through me to get to her. Maximilian stepped directly between Kozlov's gun and Evangeline's chair, spreading his arms wide. Behind him, he could hear her sharp intake of breath. Maximilian, I love you, he said without turning around. I loved your voice before I knew your name. I loved your strength before I understood your courage. And I love your heart even though I broke it. You stubborn, impossible man, she whispered. The warehouse windows exploded inward as the FBI tactical team breached simultaneously from 4 directions. Kozlov spun toward the noise, giving Maximilian the split second he needed to tackle the man and send his weapon skittering across the concrete floor. The firefight lasted 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Kozlov's men were down and the third was surrendering with his hands raised. Kozlov himself lay unconscious beneath Maximilian, who was already cutting Evangeline's restraints with a knife borrowed from the nearest agent. Are you hurt? He asked, running his hands over her arms and face to check for injuries. I'm fine, but Agent Torres needs medical attention. Paramedics were already working on the wounded FBI agent, while other agents secured Victoria, who was regaining consciousness slowly. Is it over? Evangeline asked. Sterling's network is finished. The money trail led to accounts in 12 countries, all of them frozen now. He won't be buying his way out of this. Evangeline stood slowly, testing her balance after hours in the chair. And us? Is that over too? Maximilian cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. That depends on whether you can forgive a man who was too broken to recognize salvation when it sang to him in a chapel. I might be able to manage that, under certain conditions. Name them. No more lies. No more games. No more choosing revenge over trust. Done. And you have to ask properly. Maximilian dropped to one knee on the warehouse floor, pulling a ring from his jacket pocket. He had bought it the day after Sterling's arrest, hoping against hope that he would get the chance to use it. Evangeline Thornfield, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that your voice didn't just wake me up, it saved me? She looked down at the man who had threatened her family, manipulated her emotions, and then risked his life to save hers. The diamond caught the light from the warehouse fluorescence, throwing tiny rainbows across the concrete floor. Yes, you impossible, stubborn, beautiful man. Yes. When he slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the applause from the FBI agents echoed through the warehouse like music. Evangeline laughed against his lips, the sound carrying all the joy that had been missing from both their lives. 6 months later, they were married in the restored chapel at Ravencrest Manor, with Martha and Henry walking Evangeline down the aisle and Agent Williams serving as maid of honor. Victoria, fully recovered and working with the FBI to help other families affected by Sterling's crimes, gave a reading about second chances and the power of forgiveness. As Evangeline sang their wedding vows in the same chapel where their story began, Maximilian understood finally what his grandmother had meant about prophecies. Love hadn't just conquered revenge. It had transformed 2 broken people into something stronger than either could have been alone. The voice that had called him home from his own private war would sing him to sleep every night for the rest of their lives. 8 months after their wedding, Evangeline stood in the renovated music room of Ravencrest Manor, watching Maximilian review architectural plans for the community center they were building in downtown Seattle. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the Steinway piano that had been his wedding gift to her. The recording studio should be finished by Christmas, he said, looking up from the blueprints. Local artists will have access to professional equipment without the corporate contracts. And the youth programs? Funded for the next 5 years. Martha's already volunteering to coordinate the gardening workshops. Evangeline smiled, thinking of the woman who had raised her, now teaching inner-city children how to grow vegetables in rooftop gardens. The Rosehavens had moved into the guest house on the estate, finally accepting the family status they had always deserved. Sterling's final appeal was denied yesterday, Maximilian added quietly. Good. Evangeline's voice carried no satisfaction, only relief. Maybe now everyone can finally move forward. Sterling Ravencrest would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, his network of corruption dismantled piece by piece over months of trials and testimony. The fortune he had stolen was being returned to victims across 3 states, though nothing could bring back the lives he had destroyed. Victoria called this morning, Evangeline said, settling onto the piano bench. The documentary about the case has been picked up by Netflix. How does she feel about that? Proud, I think. She wants other families to know they're not alone if something like this happens to them. Victoria had surprised everyone by becoming an advocate for victims of financial crimes, working with law enforcement to identify patterns of corporate fraud. Her relationship with Evangeline remained complicated but was growing stronger with each honest conversation they shared. Maximilian walked over and sat beside her on the bench, his fingers finding the piano keys automatically. He had been taking lessons from Evangeline, claiming that a man married to a musical genius should at least be able to play chopsticks without embarrassing himself. Play something, he requested. What do you want to hear? Something new. Something that's just ours. Evangeline's hands moved across the keys, weaving together a melody that had been developing in her mind for weeks. It started with the haunting tones that had first drawn him to the chapel, then evolved into something brighter, more complex, full of hope and possibility. I've been thinking about children, she said as she played. Maximilian's hands stilled on the keys. Children, not immediately, but someday. I want to know what you think about raising a family here. In this house. In this life. With all its complications and history. Maximilian was quiet for a long moment, watching her fingers dance across the keys. I think any child raised by you would be incredibly lucky. And I think this house needs the sound of young voices to balance out all the ghosts. Our children will know the truth about everything. About Sterling, about my father, about how we found each other. Even the parts where I was a complete fool. Especially those parts. Character development is important in any good story. They played together in comfortable silence until Evangeline's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and frowned. What is it? Henry wants us to come to the chapel. He says there's something we need to see. They walked across the grounds hand in hand, enjoying the warm afternoon that had brought the estate's gardens into full bloom. The chapel looked different now, restored to its original beauty with stained glass windows that had been professionally cleaned and stonework that gleamed in the sunlight. Henry Rosehaven stood waiting for them by the altar, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that suggested he was holding on to a secret. What's the mystery, Henry? Maximilian asked. Found something when we were cleaning out the old storage room behind the altar. Thought you should see it before anyone else. He led them to a small door hidden behind the altar that none of them had noticed before. Inside the cramped space, covered in decades of dust, sat an ornate wooden chest with brass hinges. Looks like it's been here since the chapel was built, Henry explained. Key was hanging on a nail right next to it. Evangeline knelt beside the chest and turned the key in the lock. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing contents that made her gasp audibly. Inside were dozens of journals, their leather covers worn soft with age. The top one was dated 1892 and bore the name Adelaide Ravencrest in fading ink. Your great-great-grandmother, Maximilian whispered. Evangeline opened the journal carefully, reading the flowing script on the first page. For the wives and daughters who will come after me, who will sing in this sacred space and find their heart's truest calling. The chapel was built for voices like ours, for love that transcends circumstance and time. May you find the courage to trust what your heart knows to be true, even when the world conspires against you. She flipped through pages filled with recipes, advice, family stories, and pressed flowers from gardens long since changed. But it was the final journal, dated just 3 years earlier, that made her hands tremble. The last entry was in Adelaide's shaky handwriting. The girl with the golden voice has found her way home at last. Maxwell will choose love over vengeance, just as the chapel showed me in my dreams. Their children will carry the music forward, and the Ravencrest legacy will finally be what it was always meant to be, a celebration of life, not a monument to grief. Maximilian read over her shoulder, his arm tightening around her waist. She knew. She knew everything that was going to happen. She believed in us before we even knew each other existed. Henry cleared his throat softly. There's something else. At the bottom of the chest. Evangeline reached beneath the journals and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a simple gold necklace with a pendant shaped like a musical note, obviously handcrafted with loving attention to detail. Wedding gift from the first Adelaide to her daughter-in-law, Henry explained. Been waiting more than a century for the right person to wear it. Maximilian took the necklace from the box and fastened it around Evangeline's neck, his fingers gentle at her nape. The pendant settled perfectly at the hollow of her throat, catching the light from the stained glass windows. Perfect fit, he murmured against her ear. Everything about this feels like destiny, Evangeline whispered back. They walked home through the gardens as evening approached, carrying the chest of journals between them. Tomorrow they would read more of Adelaide's wisdom, learn more about the family history that connected them to generations of love stories played out in the chapel. But tonight, they would make their own music in the house that had finally become a home.